The second and his ability to inspire unwavering loyalty in his men. His army was a melting pot of cultures: Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, and Libyans, all united under his command. Their castles the Rhone River. The Rhone was wide, deep, and fast-flowing, presenting a major logistical challenge. A hostile Gallic tribe, the Volcae, had gathered on the eastern bank, determined to contest the crossing. Hannibal once again demonstrated his tactical genius. He sent a detachment of troops under his brother Mago on a covert night march upriver. Mago's forces crossed the river unopposed and positioned themselves to attack the Gauls from the rear. Meanwhile, Hannibal's main army began constructing large rafts and commandeering local boats. The war elephants were terrified of the water and refused to board the rafts. Cunningly, the engineers built earth-covered rafts, tricking the beasts into thinking they were walking on solid ground. When Hannibal's main force began its crossing, the Gauls rushed to the riverbank to meet them. Just as the battle was joined, Mago's force launched their surprise attack. Caught between two forces, but of Rome itself, he declared. His speech rekindled a flicker of hope in the hearts of his soldiers. The descent, however, proved to be even more difficult and dangerous than the ascent. The Italian side of the Alps is steeper, and the sun melted the snow during the day, which then in its primary objective. It completely upended Roman strategy and seized the initiative for Carthage. For the next 15 years, Hannibal would terrorize young boy to his father. This vow fueled a lifelong ambition to humble the mighty Roman Republic. Hannibal spent years meticulously preparing his army in the Iberian Peninsula. He understood that his soldiers needed to be more than just mercenaries. They had to be a brotherhood. The decision to march was a gamble of epic proportions, risking everything on a single, decisive campaign. The initial march through northern Iberia was a brutal, bloody affair. He secured his rear by leaving his brother Hasdrubal in command of the newly conquered lands. As they approached the Alps, the sheer scale of the mountains would have daunted any lesser commander. The air grew thin and cold, a stark contrast to the warm climates his soldiers were accustomed to. The mountain tribes were not a unified force, but a collection of clans, each defending its own territory. Hannibal's guides, sourced from friendly Gallic tribes, were essential for navigating the confusing passes. The loss of pack animals was particularly severe, as they carried the army's vital food and supplies. The elephants, while terrifying in battle, were a logistical nightmare in the mountains. Their handlers, or mahouts, showed incredible bravery in guiding the giant animals through the peril. Each day was a struggle for survival against the elements and the enemy. The sight of the Italian plains was a powerful psychological boost for the exhausted army. Hannibal allowed his men and animals several days to rest and recover after the ordeal. He needed to recruit local Gauls, who were enemies of Rome, to replenish his depleted ranks. His victory at the Battle of Ticinus, a small cavalry engagement, helped win over these crucial allies. The Roman response was initially slow and overconfident, underestimating the threat Hannibal posed. The crossing of the Alps was a strategic masterpiece that shifted the entire dynamic of the war. It forced Rome to fight a It was a brutal, costly, yet ultimately brilliant strategic stroke that defined its commander. The world would never forget the general who marched his elephants over the mountains. The political climate in Carthage was fraught with internal division and rivalry. Faction led by Hanno the Great opposed the Barcid family's aggressive expansionist policies. Hannibal knew he could not rely on consistent support or reinforcements from home. This isolation made his plan to live off the land and recruit allies in Italy even more critical. The psychological strain of the constant danger and cold was immense. Hannibal's constant presence, sharing the hardships of his men, was crucial for maintaining discipline. The two-day halt at the rock slide was a moment of near-total despair for the army. The engineering feat to clear the path was a triumph of collective effort and desperation. Genius.